is the one that was voted. What was it? It was voted. The Christian Parish. Century picked it, and the Parish, yeah, one of the top 10 books for pastors. Books for pastors. Something like that, some year. So if we could start gathering around, getting in our seats. So I'm Alex Thornburg. I'm the pastor here at Heartland Presbyterian Church, and along with Trinity Presbyterian in Indianola, and along with Iowa Interfaith Power and Light. I got it right, didn't I, Irene? Very much so. Kind of sponsored this. We're so excited at your presence tonight. Something we've been working on for months, and we wanted to be sure. And thank you for coming. I will be introducing. Some of us will be introducing to you the workshop leaders tomorrow before the workshop, so that you'll know who you're going to learn from and connect with in the morning. Tomorrow I'll probably also introduce members of the leadership team that worked so hard to put this together. We'll do that for you as well. So, but tonight I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Greenway. You would think we chose Dr. Greenway because what better name to speak on the environment? And that I could say that's why we asked him to come speak with us tonight. It just seemed to fit. I could say we asked him to come speak tonight because he is a professor from the best seminary, Austin Seminary, I graduated from. We could say it was that. But really, Dr. Greenway's been writing, professor of theology, philosophical theology in Austin Seminary since 84? No, 98? Maybe? 98, okay, that's right, 98, so that's right, 98. Somewhere in there, so, and actually was writing on and wrestling with questions about the environment and climate change way back before it was popular, I guess. So we were very excited to have him come and be with us tonight to share some of his ideas. At the heart of this conference is, in a way, our wrestling as communities of churches with climate change and the transformations that need to happen, not just materially, but spiritually and culturally, in order for us to tackle the challenges before us. And Dr. Greenway is going to help us with some of those issues and how to think about in those kinds of ways. His wife is... He's much like me. His wife is much smarter than he is. He is a theology professor also at Austin Seminary. And he has 2 children, and it's always, we should always be thankful for those who come from, he has an 18-year-old son, Xander, who is got his senior year activities, and so it was great that we could steal you away, and a 16-year-old daughter, Jessica. They live in Austin, Texas. So please welcome Dr. Greenway. Thank you very much for being here.
All right, great. Is this on? It sounds like it's on. So, it is great to be here. I'm so pleased to be here. It actually is so beautiful, and the music and the pictures are so nice, I hate to interrupt. It's just a beautiful study to be in. What a wonderful sanctuary. I really appreciate your hospitality, and I think we first met, what was it, in November to talk about this? So the group's been planning this for a long time, done a lot of hard work, and good to see it coming to fruition, and it looks like it's such an exciting slate of people today and tomorrow to speak. So I'm really happy to be here and to be a part of it with you all. I was joking with Alex that, I published essays on climate change in the Dallas Morning News and the Houston Chronicle back when George Bush was governor. So yes, I've been doing this a while. But tonight and tomorrow, actually, I'm not going to talk about climate change. There's some other folks and some scientists and others who can do that specifically. I'm going to address more spirituality and talk about creation spirituality. And in particular tonight, I'm going to focus on the first creation account. So this is, I'm going to make some preliminary remarks, and then I'm going to try and do what I hope is somewhat interesting, and then I hope there's time for ample conversation in which you can ask whatever you want about any of this, and I'll address that. So hopefully that'll work out and be a good evening for you all. Let me just make some, I'm leaning tonight on two books. So I'm going to kind of be ad hoc and hopefully be more interesting by being a little more extemporaneous. But in terms of the tight argument, this book, For the Love of All Creatures, the story of grace in Genesis, which is about the first really 11 chapters, the primeval history in Genesis. A lot of stuff in here from the prophets. This is all Hebrew scriptures. There's nothing else in this book. And also, of course, by focusing on grace in Genesis, I'm making a move against the whole grace law dichotomy that you sometimes get between the New Testament and the Hebrew scriptures. But anyway, so this is where a lot of what I'm doing, if you want to get a tight argument in the defense, this is where you would go. And then I'm going to pull a little bit tomorrow, and then this is another book, Agape Ethics, Moral Realism, and Love for All Life. And this book doesn't have any scripture or theology in it at all. It has, I think it's theology because it's ethics and morality and love for all creatures. So that, to me, is theology. But it's a philosophical argument. So that's another piece, and you can look for that. But especially love of all creatures. All right, so the reason I'm focusing tonight, and I love the quote you had in the blurb for the conference, that at the heart of the ecological crisis is a spiritual crisis, which has enabled it. And we're not, in the long run, going to address climate change or the environmental or ecological crisis without addressing the spiritual crisis which lies underneath it. And so that is what I'm going to be focusing on and talking about tonight. And that's my first preliminary remark. I have a couple of preliminary remarks. The second preliminary remark is the spiritual crisis challenge with the environment has always been with us, right? I mean, so you have the prophets talking about the clear cutting of trees, right? So in some ways, there's nothing new about that challenge with us. That's always been something that we have had to deal with. But the environmental crisis today is worsened by a couple of things. In particular, what I'm going to address is the spiritual poverty of modern Western rationality. And in particular, the fact that modern Western rationality has difficulty positing any ethical reality. So that's why you have a crisis of foundation. I'm naming famous things. A crisis of foundation in ethics, a legitimation crisis in political theory, and interminable debates over sovereignty in political theory and lit departments. And so there's a poverty of moral understanding in modern rationality. And that's one place where faith traditions, and what I'm doing tonight, it comes into play. The second is, and let me do this, because it'll be familiar. When you get to modern rationality, it's between self-interest and enlightened self-interest. But modern thought has no way to get beyond enlightened self-interest. So you can't get beyond self-interest somehow. That's where the folks are caught. And then secondly is the radical anthropocentrism of modern Western rationality, which is ironic because in the modern period with our understanding of evolution, we understand ourselves to be connected to the rest of the life more profoundly than ever before. But simultaneously, we are more anthropocentric than almost any prior age. And when we read the Hebrew scriptures, we're reading essentially the writings of an indigenous peoples who are embedded within creation and among creatures. And we're going to see tonight how that reflects in ways that we don't hear anymore because we're so radically anthropocentric, right? For instance, in Hebrew scriptures, there's no distinction between human and animal. That's a modern distinction. There's a distinction between humans and goats, and humans and elephants, and humans and dogs. But there's not a wholesale distinction, which is given wholesale ontological and ethical significance, between humans and animals. So you don't have nature, an inanimate thing, and then animals, right, which are lesser, and then humans. You have a creator over creation full of creatures. It's a completely different way of integrating things, right? Or consider the very word environmental. So if I started talking about my environment and how it was too crowded, and what I meant is there's too many of you in here, you'd be a little insulted, right? Because of course you're not part of my environment. But typically when we say environment, what that word will resonate with is everything that is other than human, right? And of course climate change can be seen in that way. In some ways it's now getting traction. I mean, we've known about this problem for three decades, clearly, right? It's getting traction now because we're seeing it's actually a threat to us. And so to address climate change is to address the threat of climate change for humans. So once again, it's embedded. Now I'm going to teach a class in the fall called environmental ethics. So I'm not in some sort of a knee-jerk rejection of the word environmental, but to keep track of what the language is doing. The way environmental tends to mean the humans in relationship to everything else, which is now our environment, right? Instead of the creation we're all a part of. And I already did my second point, which is this all comes together with how climate change is now in some ways being taken seriously, in some ways addressed within wholly anthropocentric perspectives, right? Which means that the entire motivation for addressing climate change pivots on self-interest, right? But the solutions to climate change can't turn on self-interest. They're going to have to turn on being for others, on a moral reality. So it's the self-interested motivational structure and the way it's played out in concrete ways amongst various corporate and government and other entities, which has kept us from addressing and naming climate change seriously. But when we get concerned about climate change and that concern is energized through self-interest, we actually, willy-nilly end up energizing the very self-interested dynamics which are at the heart of the problem. And so the short-term end gain of that is going to be coping structures, which in the short term are going to favor global elites. In the long term, it's going to be disastrous in a way that no one gets to escape. So, but the challenge is to raise this without triggering that self-interested response, which goes opposite from the sort of moral and ethical response that we need. Right? So, I mean, the other piece here, let me add, is simply that we are the first generations, maybe going back a generation or two, which are bigger than the planet. So for most of human history, the planet was bigger than we were. We might be able to devastate some local area ecologically, some island or some small ecosystem, but we couldn't overcome the entire planet. We couldn't extinguish all species. We're in the midst of an epical extinction event, which is largely human-driven. That's unthinkable before. So we're the pivotal generations in history, right? At least in this iteration of history. I mean, if we blow it, there's a lot of time left. There might be other iterations of history. But in terms of the creatures that exist now, the landscapes, the rivers, the diversity that exists now, what's lost is lost for the rest of this iteration of human history. And we're that generation. Suddenly that's upon us, right? Prior generations didn't have that. And it's because we have such technological advance, right? We're gods on earth in the ways the ancients couldn't even have dreamed of. So we're literally the little kids who've taken over the spacecraft and somehow have control over the spacecraft that can blow up planets, and you're hoping that somehow they don't blow things up before growing up, right? That is literally the situation we're in. And that's why, now, that can make us terrified too and look short term. Tomorrow we're talking about some practical strategies to take. The thing I'm going to emphasize is the need to be polyvalent. We need short-term solutions. We need short-term appeal to self-interest if it's strategically significant enough, but simultaneously we need to work on the long-term too and work on these spiritual solutions and changing the way people think in these sorts of ways. All right. My final qualifying remark is that I do philosophical spirituality. And so my arguments everywhere, even when I use Scripture, are nowhere appeals to authority. I maintain that what I'm doing is wholly reasonable, and any reasonable person should be able to see that and argue with it or agree with it or whatever. But I'm not making any sort of special appeals. So just to put that out there. All right, so what I want to do is, tonight, to give you something substantive, is focus on the 7 days of creation account. And the reason I want to focus on that account is it's the one that's the Imago Dei, have dominion and subdue, right? So maybe of all the scripture passages used in the modern period, this is the passage which has been appealed to justify the most abusive approaches to the rest of creation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Adam and Eve narrative, which is often a narrative that environmentalists love for reasons that I'll talk in a second. I'm going to argue, actually, that the 7 days of creation narrative is obviously and clearly a profound call to love all creatures and all creation. Exactly contrary to how it's been understood, and I'm going to argue this is obviously the case. It's a systemic distortion, and the reason we haven't read it that way is because it's not been in our self-interest to read it that way. So another reading has seemed obvious. That's going to be the move I'm going to try to make anyway. Okay, before I move to that, though, I want to say one more systemic distortion of modern rationality, which is pertinent to this, is the idea that if you're going to take a text seriously, you're going to read it like a scientific text. Literally, that's the sort of texts that have truth value, and that's how to read them. This is why the leading creationists all have PhDs and are leaders in their fields in the natural sciences. And then they try to take these creation accounts seriously, and the only way they know how to take accounts seriously is to read it like a scientific account. And so they do that. This is a genre mistake. And it's a mistake not only made by creationists who read this as primitive science, who read this as science and trying to argue for it as science, which is a category mistake. It's also a mistake made by scientists and other secular elites who dismiss these texts as primitive science. They are just as wrong and make the same genre mistake, right? So I want to move to these creation narratives, but I want to be sure to say that I'm taking them seriously as truth-carrying narratives, but not as scientific narratives. And I also hope to make it clear that's how the ancient Israelites would have felt about them as well. All right. Did you have a question?
I didn't know what
Anthropocentric, human-centered. Human-centered. So, if I ask how many creatures are in this room and you start counting people and leave out the plants and the other creatures, or if you walk into this space and you don't notice the disconnect from all the other creatures, which we don't, right? I mean, I drove a car to the airport, I've been in one bubble after another the whole day, right? I teach wilderness courses where I'm out under a tarp for 17 days. When I get back, and my students too, we walk inside the spaces like this and you're antsy because you can feel they're dead. You're not connected to all of that other energy, right? I discovered when I had my kids too, you know how you put them on the dryer to get them to shake? Which is, I did this. I was taught, and it worked. But what I found that worked even better is just walking outside. Suddenly, they had all this sensory input, right? And it's just, they would get quiet immediately and take this in, right? So anthropocentric is not to notice that, to think only in terms of people. And so environmentalism often can be entirely anthropocentric. We can have discussions of climate change about, and again, I don't want to be knee-jerk against this. There's a lot of good stuff going on. But oftentimes the entire discussion, who's affected, how, it's completely anthropocentric. It's only about people, right? That would be, again, a function of modern Western rationality in many ways. It's not how the Hebrews think. We'll see that. right? It's these wonderfully inclusive visions. It's and it's not just the Hebrews. This is not true to any of the world's major wisdom traditions, faith traditions, right? So ironically enough, it's the rationality that knows about the truth of evolution which has instigated a radical division between the human and animals. So it turns out the biblical language is a better language. Creator, creatures, creation. Not humans, animal, nature. It instantiates different things. Okay, we can build on that further. All right, so one more thing just in terms of these creation accounts. There's two creation accounts at the beginning of Genesis. And everyone kind of knows this on one hand and doesn't know it on the other. It's the 7 days of creation, right? And then the Adam and Eve account. And these are two separate accounts. They're stacked one on top of each other. They're clearly different accounts. In Hebrew, this is a little more obvious because they use different names for the word God. One refers to God wherever you see God. And in English, you see God and Lord God to bring this across. But one is Elohim and the other is Yahweh, right? And plus, as everyone I think probably knows off the top of their head, the order of creation is different in the two accounts, right? So in one account, it's Adam, and then everything else, all the other animals and creatures, and then Eve. And the other account, it's all the places, and then all the other creatures, and then male and female together, right? So to think this is a historical or a scientific account, you'd have to think the people who wrote this were complete idiots, right? No one's been this stupid. They noticed. They didn't care. This wasn't the point. This isn't a science text. It's not a history text. It's kind of like if you love the Grinch who stole, what is it, the Grinch who stole Christmas, right? Right? Is that true? Does Christmas bring your heart? It is true. But no, there's no such thing as Grinches. That's not true. How about Shakespeare? Is all the world a stage? No. Right? What an idiot Shakespeare is. Right? That can't be true. Right? That's how the Israelites would react to us reading these as scientific accounts. Right? That's how obviously they're not science. But they're true. They're true in the way Shakespeare is true. They're true in the way that there's truth in the Grinch who stole Christmas. Right? This is where they're profoundly true, and in some ways, some of the most important truths for us today to hear. Right? That's how true and important they are. All right. Okay. I hope that wasn't upsetting to anyone. By the way, I grew up in a town. Actually, I grew up in a town where the so-called gap theory was developed, a creationist theory. So lots of creationists. I disagree with their creationism, but their spirituality and their spirit was wonderful. So I want to, so we keep track of that. We don't wholesale make attacks on folks. Okay, all right. So how to read a creation account. So to help us think about how to read a creation account. And now, when I'm going to read these accounts, I'm reading them like I would read Plato, or Aristotle, or Kant, or someone like that, right? And actually, I find them on those grounds profound. So this will be the sort of move we'll make, right? So let's read another account. Let's read the account of the Babylonians, the Enuma Elish, which is such a cool name. I wish we had that cool a name. It's better than Adam and Eve's okay. 7 days of creation is, but Enuma Elish, right? And this is the epic of creation of the Babylonians. And I'm not just picking this out of thin air because the primeval history we have, and in particular the 7 days of creation account, reached its received form, right, and was written at the end of the exilic period or just after the exile. And where were the Israelites in exile? In Babylon, right? So I'm not just picking another ancient Near Eastern creation account. I'm rereading the ancient Near Eastern creation account, which all the ancient Israelites knew and would have in the back of their minds when they're reading their creation account. Okay, just so we have that sort of clear. So the Enuma Elish, and I'm just going to run it down here again kind of quickly. The Enuma Elish has two great gods, which are the source of everything, Absu and Tiamat. And Absu is the name means fresh water, and Tiamat means sea or salt water. So the gods that are origin of everything are Absu and Tiamat. I don't think it's an accident that the most fertile places on earth are where you have the commingling of fresh and sea waters. They're just absolutely the most fertile places on earth. I don't think that's maybe accidental. And they become the source of all the other gods. And so Apsu and Tiamat propagate and make all sorts of other gods. But, and some parents will resonate with this, they make so many younger gods, a lot of them are raucous, and then Apsu and Tiamat can't get any rest. They can never rest. They can never get any sleep, right? So Apsu in particular is upset about this. And so Apsu comes up with a plan where he's going to kill a whole bunch of the raucous gods so he can finally get some rest again, right? So the younger gods find out about this, and one of them, Ea, manages to kill Apsu and undercut Apsu because Apsu is going to try and kill them. And out of the pure interior of Apsu, Ea makes Marduk, who is this wonderful, pure god and a champion of these other gods and a hero of these other gods. Now, while Ea is making Marduk, and all these other gods are liking Marduk and are happy with Ea because Ea killed Apsu, the other gods, the ones who had been quiet, who were friends of Apsu, start saying to Tiamat, "What are you doing? Right? They've killed Apsu, and you're just doing nothing. How are you allowing this to go unpunished without any reticence?" So Tiamat, she makes a plan then that she is going to wipe out these other gods. And Tiamat is super powerful. So these other gods are just terrified. I mean, I have the citations, quotes in here if you want to read this and with a lot of quotes to get it. But essentially, it's shaking in their boots is a rough translation. So they're shaking in the boots, and Marduk says, "Hey, look, if I go and take care of Tiamat and Tiamat's general, who is Kingu, you all keep track of these names, okay? Kingu, Tiamat and Kingu. This is the one place where I was going to use videos so you can at least see the names. But Kingu, if I do that, will you let me be your ruler? I'll be the ruler." And the other gods, they're terrified, and they're like, "Yes," right? So Marduk goes and engages Tiamat in battle, and Marduk defeats Tiamat. And out of Tiamat, Marduk makes the heavens and the earth and the stars and the sun and everything that is our creation, right? So that didn't exist yet. We were just in this heavenly realm of gods before this. But now all of this creation is made. And then Kingu is seized, and because Kingu was the co-conspirator, the Kingu is slain, and out of Kingu, Marduk makes people. And Marduk makes people so the gods can be at leisure. All right? And Marduk, it turns out, is pretty merciful because Marduk doesn't do anything else to all the other rebellious gods. He allows them to join back in with all the other gods and to be at leisure with them. And he calls on the people to remember Marduk and his mercy, and always have shrines to Marduk, and to maintain priests and who will remember Marduk and remember all this that's transpired. All right, and let me look and make sure I didn't leave out anything essential. I don't think I did. Oh, well, let me just say, this story was read or maybe performed every year for all the people in Babylon at the New Year's celebration, right? So this would be something would everyone be familiar with. They'd grow up with it. They would have it rehearsed every single year. All right. So if you think of this as science, it's pretty bad science, right? As we're going to see, the creation accounts in Genesis are pretty bad science, even by ancient Israelite standards. Again, but they're not doing science, right? So the thing to remember when you think these people are doing bad science is they're living in wilderness conditions that would have killed any of us in a number of weeks, right? But these people know how nature works. They're living in nature. They're cultivating. They know how, they don't know about nuclear physics, but they're not ignorant about how nature works, creation works. Okay, so this can sound like a fantastical account, but it's actually, I think, ultra realistic. Right? So how do you read an account like this? What does this account say? What is this account as a metaphysic? What does this account as a meta-narrative, kind of a background cosmology of how things are, right? So what does it say about the ultimate character of existence? Well, the ultimate character of existence is a conflict. It's a chaotic conflict between chaos and good and disorder and destruction and evil, right? So what's fundamental are two principles, which are a mixture, right? So Apsu has a pure interior, but he also plots to kill his children. Tiamat can be this massive threatening force, right? There's one time the sea, you're still on the surface, but now and again from the depths you come up, right? And are this destructive force. So ultimately, existence is a mixture of good and evil, chaotic and deadly forces. That is the ultimate character of existence, right? Now, what's the character of us, and what should we expect? Well, we shouldn't expect things to be great because we were created to serve the gods so that they can be at leisure. So if life is hard, if we've got to work to survive, that shouldn't be a surprise. That's how things were created, right? Moreover, not only is the fundamental character of reality rebellious, and only gets ordered insofar as some powerful force, some God, sustains it, right? Sustains the order, right? But each of us are made out of Kingu, out of a rebellious God. So each of us also are rebellious. We have that in us as well, right? So what we need to do is we need to see that to maintain the order, we have to be always aware, because chaos threatens constantly both from without and from within. It's only through the power of someone like Marduk, right, or the monarch in Babylon, right, that you keep the chaotic forces at bay and you have enough order to have a civil society. And even if things aren't going great for you, they're going better than they would in absolute chaos. So work to maintain that order. On the other hand, Marduk is merciful. And Marduk takes care of the gods, right, mercifully, and Marduk takes care of the people. So this says something about the monarch. What should a monarch be like? Well, a monarch should be someone not who is seizing power and is, domineering, but a monarch is someone who is merciful, strong against real forces and enemies, but merciful the second they're under control, right? And a caretaker, right? Caretaking for all the people, right? And they've established shrines in a priesthood, right? So an independent strata of society with its own financing that's called for, whose job is to remind the people in the Marduk of the story remind the people and the monarch of this story of Marduk, right? So let's say your monarch is not merciful. Let's say your monarch is beginning to abuse their power, is beginning to act more like Tiamat or more like Kingu, right? Well, now you have a priestly class and a ceremony whose job is to call the monarch back, and you have also a basis for insurrection if the monarch is not like Marduk, but is instead like Tiamat or Kingu. Right? In other words, these are the background ideas that are woven into this story, and in some ways, again, they're very realistic, right? The cosmos is not just our friend, it's hostile. We need order to survive, right? We are chaotic from within and from without. It looks like, in some ways, looks like a hyper-realistic account of the character of existence, right? Don't, by the way, have any naive hopes that Marduk's going to come and save you, in particular, or, you're created to serve the gods. So understand your place, work to sustain that order. Chaos is always at bay, as it would have been when you had invading territories or you had other natural disasters or famine, right? Chaos is always, again, this is very real to people, but what you're going to look to do is to keep chaos at bay through a good order. Now, let me just say, this is sexist and patriarchal. I'm just going to leave that there because it is, but it's not the essence of it. But it does have a real it does matter. As I'm going to go say, but I'm going to stop with that, right? Any questions just about that? So you get a sense of the Enuma Elish and how it functions in some ways in an ultra-realistic sort of metaphysic or understanding about the character of reality, and it tends to undergird a certain organization of society. By the way, I'd like to come back to this eventually, and I'm not sure I'll have time to, so I'll do it now by saying it seems to me not a bad idea to have a separate structure whose whole purpose is to call the people and the rulers to what is good, right? This might be a way of thinking of the church as the fourth estate, if the fourth estate can be largely purchased in particular, and as a constructive way of thinking about a separation of church and state, which is not an alienation, and not just, of course, Christian churches, but puts faith traditions that are looking towards the good in a critical relationship to the state on a continual basis. They provided for that within Babylonian society. All right? Okay. So, so that's how to read a creation account. That's how to think about a creation account philosophically, and have something that looks initially fantastic and see how actually it's in some ways hyper-realistic. Okay. So the 7 days of creation and the Adam and Eve account have been, in some ways, within the environmental movement, put over and against one another, right? Adam, Adam is created from Adama. So in the first place, the link between, in the Adam and Eve account, of humans and the earth is very tight, right? So Adama is earth. So a really tight translation would be a human from humus. Right? Human from humus, Adam from Adama, right? So in the 7 days of creation, our link to the earth is incredibly tight. And of course, Adam is called to be a steward of the earth, right? To till the soil, to take care of it, to be a good steward, right? And so this is a reason why the Adam and Eve account in particular has been used and been very friendly for environmentalists because it goes this way. In contrast often to the 7 days of creation account, which has often been seen as the exact opposite, because that's the created in the image of God, rule and dominion, right? And so that's often been put in contrast. Again, though, I think, as I'm going to argue, that the 7 days of creation account is actually the more powerful account, and it's actually needed to contextualize the Adam and Eve account, because you have the question of, well, why? Who am I a steward for? Right? So it's easy, especially in our time period, to read that in anthropocentric, human-centered terms, and think that what I'm being a good steward for future generations of people. And so then, and in some ways that will work out for people, I'm going to be a good steward for me and mine. Future generations of me or mine. This is not how would be read in context, but the problem with taking the Adam and Eve narrative alone is it's very susceptible to that appropriation, of being an anthropocentric appropriation and one which actually you're doing this for the sake of your next generations, right? So it remains self-centered. Okay. So the 7 days of creation account, and like most of you in your churches, I'm not going to pause to read this whole thing. It's so long. You know, we never read it all. I don't know if you ever do, but we read, these sections of it but the length is significant, right? The account luxuriates in every day of creation, right? And there's 7 days, they're arranged poetically. In the first 3 days, spaces are made, the various spaces are made, and the second 3 days, those respective spaces are filled with various creatures, right? And at the end of every day, we hear, it was good, it was good, it was good. And this is not an ethical evaluation. This is not a dispassionate evaluation. This is like you've just had a really good ice cream cone, right? And that was good, right? It's delight, right? It's joyous celebration. And sometimes people think, well, how joyous could you be after just the third day? There's no creatures anywhere yet. But that's just like a really good beach day, right? Where there's no one else on the beach. You're just enjoying everything, right? And there's nothing bothering you yet. But every day we have this delight. So that the text just luxuriates in every day of creation. It has God taking joy in every day of creation. I mean, there's this intimate celebration of every day. And then when creatures are created, of course, blessings are a big deal. There's a blessing. Now, most everyone knows about the blessing of humans, right? Be fruitful and multiply, have dominion, rule, that. But earlier on, and this is even missed sometimes in scholarly accounts where the blessings they know are significant, the birds and the fishes are blessed and told to be fruitful and multiply. And in the flood narrative, that blessing is extended to all the land animals as well, right? So the blessings are not just for humans, they're for others. All right, you know what? I missed something. I'm going to go back because this is going to help I want to talk about systemic distortion because it goes to the blessings thing. I want to, in terms of the way so a systemic distortion refers to a way in which our understanding is structured in such a way that we don't hear things that are right in front of us. Because the way and this is not a plot, this is not propaganda. The idea here is it's simply not in our self-interest to hear it. So we will tend not to hear it. There's no evil person behind this. This is just kind of natural, right? And so one of the ways in which I can make this visible is with the so-called Noahic Covenant. Have you all heard of the Noahic Covenant? Covenant with Noah? Some of you heard of the covenant with Noah. And a lot of your Bibles, it'll say the covenant with Noah or the Noahic covenant. So this is the rainbow, right? Covenant, right? So and again, in many of your scriptures, it'll say the Noahic covenant, right? So this is not, I think, an unfamiliar text to most folks. So this is what makes it such, at least right now, this might phase. You might tell me that didn't work because we all think this way already, so the systemic distortion has been cured. You can let me know. I'll be happy and sad simultaneously about that. But so what I want you to listen for is whether or not calling this the Noahic covenant is radically anthropocentric in such a way that it betrays the text, right? Misrepresents the text obviously and clearly. Right? So just listen for who the covenant is with and hear if it's the Noahic covenant or the covenant with Noah. I'm just going to read the scripture. All right? I'm citing it in this book here. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." So you heard it, right? I think it's 7 times in 9 verses that it says the covenant's between God and all creatures of every kind on the earth, right? So again, no one planned this. No one was looking to trick anyone. It's a familiar passage. But obviously, to call this the Noahic covenant is to radically misrepresent it. This is the anthropocentrism, right? And again, it's not a plot. It's nothing anyone has done intentionally, right? But it just has accorded with our interest. So we have not heard what the text is saying, right? And now you won't be able to read the text without hearing it. That's how that works. And suddenly, God has covenanted repeatedly with every living creature on earth. And of course, God, in the flood, remembers all these creatures who go in 2 by 2 and come out in families, right? So even the flood narrative is not supposed to be something focused upon Noah. We all know that at one level, right? So again, the problem in terms of creation spirituality and God's love for all creatures is not with these texts. It's with the ways we have been formed to misread them. Okay. So let me now, with that, go back to what I was just saying, if I can pick up the thread again, about the blessing of the birds and fishes. That's something that's missed. And then, of course, you have, coming up shortly after in that passage, the famous passage. I'm not going to read it. I have it here. The famous passage of the humans created in the image of God, right? Male and female created in the image of God, and they hold to have dominion and subdue, right? That famous or infamous passage, and that might be one of the best known passages in all of Scripture. It's just, almost everyone knows that Imago Dei, dominion and rule passage, right? Let me read the very next verses. God said, very next verses. God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that God had made, and indeed, it was very good. Right? So the very next passage, and actually the stress is on the fruits and seeds the being eaten, right? The very next passage is fructarian. Every creature of every kind is given the fruit and seed of every plant for food. So again, we know the rule and subdue passage, but we haven't noticed the very next passage, right? Now again, no one's ever done science this badly. This is not a scientific text. The ancient Israelites did not look around and think that creation was fructarian, right? They know how the real world works. They eat as they need to survive, right? So, but what you have here, you realize suddenly, is this vision of this perfectly perfect creation, right? Doesn't mean there's not necessarily death, but nothing is killing to live. There is no strife whatsoever, right? There's no opposition to God, right? There's no Apsu versus Tiamat or a chaotic order or anything like that, or Marduk versus Tiamat going on. God speaks and the depths respond and create these spaces. And when God speaks, this beautiful creation is established with all of these creatures, right? All living in this beautiful harmony. This is, of course, the peaceable the world of Isaiah, right? Where the lion and the lamb lie down together, right? This is an eschatological passage. It's framed. Isaiah, by the way, is composed at the same time, that Isaiah passage, right? So this is this picture of this incredibly beautiful, harmonious world, the world that we would dream of that's being put out there. In that sense, this becomes the world God would have. This becomes the world that we can then work towards, would be one way to think. This is the world that would be the ideal, right? So that would be one way of looking at this. Now, that's problematic because I don't want you doing this because Scripture said to, or looking at this as a blueprint. So we need to go a little further. But nonetheless, to get firmly in mind, this picture can be inspiring. I can get this picture of this perfectly perfect world with all creatures living in harmony, all enjoying and celebrating, all of them being delightful, and being inspired by that. Right? Of course, you might want to say, well, what about that rule and subdue? What about the have dominion and the Imago Dei? Have I just ignored that? Right? And here again is a place where a systemic distortion has taken our imaginations in how to read and a certain self-interest, right? So I'm just going to, just three questions completely undo the idea that the rule and have dominion and subdue passages are problematic in this text, right? And people make all sorts of attempts here, by the way. They go elsewhere in Scripture, viceroy, stuff like that. But I want to say right in this passage, we can see a different way of running, what in retrospect is a clearly different way of reading the passage, right? So the first, don't be insulting to ask you. These are rhetorical questions. I'll give the answers. So the first question, right? Who throughout the first creation account has absolute power, absolute rule, absolute dominion? God, right? Throughout the passage. Throughout this account, what is the character of God's rule and dominion and subduing of the chaos? Well, first, God subdues the chaos to create spaces that are suitable for all creatures, and then God creates and blesses and delights in all creatures. Right? So if a single image could capture the character of God's subduing and then dominion over the creatures, and as it's actually depicted in this passage, it would be this. So why have we thought dominion should be interpreted in the way we attribute to a tyrant? Why do we equate dominion with domination? When in the passage, that is not the character of God's dominion. That is not the way in which God subdues the chaos, right? And remember, we're to subdue the earth and have dominion over creatures, right? So now, final question. If this is how God relates to every creature who is lower than God, other than God, beneath God in every conceivable respect, right? If this is the image of God in this passage, and we are to imitate God in our relationship to everything which is other and below and different from us in all these different ways, what should be our relationship to other creatures and creation? Well, it should be this. Right? So that's what this passage is saying. That's what I mean about how this passage, to read this and to think it's obvious, to see this passage is calling for us to dominate and exploit, right, and use the rest of creation for our own purposes. That is a clear misreading of the passage. And again, it's not deliberate. It's a systemic distortion which we have been afflicted by because that sort of reading tends towards our self-interest. But it clearly is alien to the spirituality of the ancient Israelites. That's the way in which the 7 days of creation narrative frames the Adam and Eve narrative. Because now the reason you're good stewards of the earth, right, and caring for every creature is because you love all of the earth. It's not for your own future generations. It's not for you and yours. Right? Now, this is still problematic in a way, because I still don't want you doing this because the Bible said so. I don't want this to be some sort of imperative, right? So maybe in these pictures you have been inspired, right? Or maybe you've been confirmed. But I think it's still important to ask, and this is what I do in the book that's really the most creative move, it's still important to ask, where in the world did the Israelites get this idea? So there is no parallel to the 7 days of creation account in the Babylonian creation epic or anywhere else. There's like tons of flood stories, right? Every ancient Near Eastern account has a flood. Something happened. And they're all very similar, interestingly enough, right? So, but this is not like that, right? And what you realize is, since in the Enuma Elish, the ultimate two principles, right, are in relationship, in particular, with both of them having good and evil in them, right? The world is ultimately a combination or a struggle of good and evil, of chaos and disorder. There's no conceptual place for this vision of a perfectly perfect world. Right? Now, in the book, I argue, just to say this, the Enuma Elish, I think, is more sophisticated than our modern Hobbesian Darwinian metaphysic, because it has no place for good and evil. Those things only come up as a result of a social contract that we imagine. The world is just a blunt force, right? At least the Enuma Elish has a place for good and evil, but ultimately the good and evil is interspersed. What's stunning here is this vision of a perfectly peaceable world, which you see nowhere. So it's a stunning thing to have this idea. Where did that come from, right? And what I propose, and this is my proposal, it's not caught on, so it might be completely wrong, is that it came from the flood narrative. And I don't have time, let me see my time. I won't have time for questions. Yeah, I don't have time to go into the flood narrative in depth, except to say, and you're going to read the book, that even people who think of God wandering around the Garden of Eden is metaphorical. They have no problem with that. When we get to the flood, they tend to start thinking literally. So first, stop doing that and recognize that God in the flood narrative is a character in a story about the divine. And that can free you up to notice that the flood was a mistake that God repents of, right? So the flood is set up as a way to start over. The narrative clearly is all this evil, we're going to start over, right? And of course, that just goes completely haywire, right? Right after the flood, Noah takes two of every kind of the animals that have been just belovedly saved, decides to kill them to initiate a covenantal relationship with God, right? And then you know what happens with Noah, caught in a sexually compromising position. So his sons are alienated from one another, one condemned to be slaves, right? And then how's the primeval history end? The Tower of Babel, right? It's a complete disaster, right? Nothing goes right. It's all set up to start over by the end of the narrative, and then you get out of the primeval history, go to the call of Abram. I will make you great. I will make you a great people, right? But the flood, now this is where it's helpful to know the Gilgamesh Epic, because in the Gilgamesh Epic you have several gods, and the gods explicitly criticize each other for bringing a flood and say that's completely disproportionate, it's awful. And the Gilgamesh Epic, the Gilgamesh Epic is kind of like the National Enquirer, and whereas the primeval history that we have is more like the New York Times, right? So the New York Times will just talk about the 10,000 deaths from the earthquake and expect you to understand the reality. And the National Enquirer will give you a lot of graphic photographs. So the Gilgamesh Epic gives you a lot of graphic photographs, which it turns out with the flood account is kind of necessary because we tend not to read the flood realistically, right? My kids participated in a church play, and I let them participate, and I want to be all positive, so don't send me to a knee-jerk thing. But the rains came down and down and down. I mean, it's just this delightful song. Everyone's dying. Everyone is dying, right? This is a horror, right? So the Israelites expect us to know the horror. This is a hyper-realistic account, this flood account, right? The flood account is their parallel to the Enuma Elish. That's the real world we know, right? And the world right after the flood, where people kill each other, where creatures and people are in conflict, where you work out the sweat of your brow, right? That's the reality. And somehow out of that reality, that's what makes the Rainbow Covenant so stunning, that's when the Rainbow Covenant comes. The Rainbow Covenant in that sense is stunning, right? So Noah gives the sacrifice, and often this is translated as a pleasing sacrifice. I think it should be translated sweet smells the sweet sacrifice, and bring to mind the sweet smell, the sweet sickly smell of burning human flesh. Not pleasing. Right? That's what a sacrifice smells like. And that's why God doesn't say, well done, good and faithful servant, but I'll never do this again because the human heart is evil from youth. That's God's response to that sacrifice. But then what do you get? I mean, God's the one who just brought the flood in the story. Then you get never again. I'll never do this again. This is my covenant with you and with every creature. Right? This is a God who's just experienced all this horror in the story, right? Remember, this is a story about the character of God that's about the divine, right? So this is a God who's just experienced all this horror, and somehow out of all that horror, which this God is culpable for, this is in this sense an atonement story, right? This God is culpable for, that God goes to a unilateral, never again covenant, where I'm going to affirm and be for you. Now, I don't have time to go into depth here, but here I'm going to go to Levinas, because I think that he makes the same move, right? So Levinas is and I'm pointing to, so Levinas is a super hard continental philosopher to understand who I love. And lo and behold, Alex loves him. So when I just don't get this from many pastors. It's just great. So anyway, Levinas, a brilliant philosopher, modern philosopher, student of Heidegger, was very much within those parameters of existentialism. In modern thought, we have science, but in addition to science and the world just being this brute thing, you have some place for human creativity and stuff in the face of death. Levinas then becomes caught up in the Shoah. His immediate family is all executed as Lithuania is overrun. His mother-in-law is killed. His wife and daughter are saved by nuns in the outskirts of Paris. He is captured as a French officer, spends 5 years in a hard labor camp. He's an officer, so he doesn't go to a concentration camp, but he wears the stars. It's 5 years at hard labor with everything you can imagine there, right? And in that context, Levinas says, that he finds something, this is again my reading of Levinas, something that was new and that broke the bounds of philosophy that he had learned from Plato to Heidegger. Just utterly broke it open, that thing. And that was the way in which he was taken hostage by the faces of others as they screamed out, "Don't kill me." And of course, in that context, he has live memories of this, right? In other words, this is contrary to another modern systemic distortion that somehow evil is the enemy of faith, right? Which doesn't make any sense if you just know that we call the birth of religions the axial age, right? The age of great disturbance is when they come out. It is precisely in the face of the greatest evil that you become aware of the fact that of the violation, but revealing what would be good. In other words, this is in this book what I call the decisive asymmetry, right? It's not good versus evil. It's evil is the negation of the good. So what you see is a violation of the good. In that sense, when you have the greatest sense of revolt and righteous anger, as a particular form of anger, and a desire to act in response to evil, right? That is love, right? So he talks about being taken hostage by the face of the other. I think he leaves something out there. I think you're taken hostage by love for the face of the other. And what has you is that love. What has you, and what I would like to call agape, right? And so you have that love in happy situations as well. Right? So you see the couple strolling down the beach happily. You see the kid at the birthday party, and you are seized by love, and you smile, and you're happy. Right? The thing to understand is when you see that same couple or that same child violated, right? It's not now that you're evil or thinking evil. It's the same love which now in that context sees evil. In other words, at that point, evil is not something that defeats love. It's at that point that your conviction over the reality of what should be, your conviction over having been seized by agape for that face, becomes manifest more powerfully than ever before. So that's the context in which, in a situation like the flood, right, or in a situation like the Shoah, you can be embedded in the most horrible situations, and in precisely that context, you become aware that you're not choosing to care for these people. Something has you for them, right? Something has you for them. Agape has you for them. You are taken hostage by agape for them. Now that is something that is then immediate. This, I think, is the brilliance of this account. I think that the ancient Israelites in this primeval history made the same move that Levinas makes in the 20th century, right? They saw the evil around them. It's not just the flood, it's all of the suffering and evil that surrounded them, and they understand that in reaction to that, what's being made manifest to them is not a cosmos which is fundamentally chaotic and a mixture of good and evil, but something which is ultimately good, which has them in one way for good, affirming, happy, building, and has them in another way, the same thing in contexts which are evil. And they react accordingly, right? But again, that passion is there. It's the same passion. In other words, from this reading, it's the flood narrative which is the genesis of the 7 days of creation account, the perfectly perfect world. Because what you can do now is you can think, what would that love have? What would that agape have? What would it be? And then you generate a vision of a world that is perfectly perfect, where all things are blessed, all things live in harmony, and everything is beautiful. They're smart enough, by the way, to make these eschatological, right? This is not something we can pull off in history. So I don't think it's an accident. I think it's wise, and this happens across religious traditions. There's not a sense that we can do this. Of course, the idea that we can bring the end of history into the present with a perfect realm has a recent political history that's disastrous, right? So realism about this is quite well informed. I'm talking about the Vanguard Party in Marxist theory, right? Marx has some good things going for him, but that idea, which is not actually Marx, that's devastating. So the eschatological placement is good. Okay, let me see. I think I'm getting, I think I'm to the end. I think I might be done. Just to say, well, don't wait, let me see. See, I lost my notes a while ago, but it's more interesting that way. But it's more precise in there. Yeah, that worked. Well, this might be important. This gives you then, this gives me a definition of faith. All right? So I take it everything I've appealed to in terms of good and evil and this field is reasonable. In fact, most secular folks I know, when they're atheists, they often give me reasons for atheists. They're indexed to agape. They're actually offended, morally offended by what they understand to be Christianity. In some cases, I'm with them, right? But it's a moral offense. That's what's ironic. So if agape is God who is love, God may be more than this, but if at any rate that's God who is love, then what faith is to live surrender to having been seized by agape for every face that elects you, which is present to you. That's what faith is at the most primordial level, right? Lots of other beliefs and stuff, but the essence of faith is surrender to having been seized by agape for every face. And of course, every face now is the face of every creature. So this isn't anthropocentric. That's an understanding of faith, which to my knowledge is shared not just by Judaism and Christianity and Islam, but also by Hinduism and Buddhism, and as best I know, all the other major traditions on earth. So if we're looking for a notion of faith, which is rooted in a reality which is arguably as real as gravity, the reality of agape, right, as a basis for global, spiritual, concerted action, then this would be a possibility, this sort of a move. Okay, that's the end. All right, so do the pictures keep playing? Oh, you should have kept playing the pictures, because, I know I'm a philosopher. It's not, and I tell lots of pretty stories in the book, right? So you can read those, but I know what I did now was more intense. But I think that we need the intensity, but I wish you'd had the pictures to turn to if you needed them. But now, there's questions on anything, or challenges of any sort, and it could be something I've talked about, or something else entirely, if you'd like. Yes?
Can I?
Wait, there's a mic.
Can we use a mic?
You don't mind? Thanks.
Okay. So we face climate change and the glaciers melting, which is going to flood everything. But God made this covenant with us that it would never happen again. And is that because we're causing it and not God causing it, that it could happen again?
I think the passage is about the change in the character of God, right? So again, it's about a character in a story. It's not about the divine. So the divine is real. So I don't think God, when I mention the divine, when I say agape, of course, when I say agape at this point, I haven't yet referenced a person, right? So God may be a person, God may be triune, but at this primordial level, which I'm interested in seeing shared across faith traditions, right? So I think that, and this is something I'm going to talk about tomorrow, I think, in the morning real quick, There's a vision of all these faiths being sectarian and alienated, when in fact every major faith tradition in the world has massive commonality on moral and ethical moves that would, if they were acted upon, affect the lives of billions of people. So that the idea that they're all in we take them wholesale and put them all in conflict, that's not done, that's not innocent. That's a strategy that's covering it over. So it's important for me to work at this level. But in terms of the passage, that's about God's transition to the God of grace, right? So the title of the chapter is The Birth of the God of Grace. Because you work from a tit-for-tat economy, from a God who's going to punish everyone with a flood and then start from scratch, to a God who is saying yes, despite the heart being evil from youth. That's the definition of grace. So that's the shift. In terms of whether God is going to change things in the future, that we can rely on God, I think the clear teaching in Scripture is no. That's why the prophets call us to do everything, right? That's why. So maybe we can have that hope, but actually in Scripture, that's always an eschatological event. It's outside of history, right? But nonetheless, we are called in the present to serve, to do what we can. But I don't think that, I wrote a book, I wrote an article a year or two ago called Extinction on request. I hadn't thought about it before. It turned out to be interesting to think about. But what I brought to mind was those comets hitting Jupiter. You all remember when that happened? Those huge comets. And we realized that any one of those would have obliterated all life on Earth. And that's when we started. That's SETI got started really shortly after that. It was like, because the odds were so far against it, but once you see it happen nearby, you're like, well, crap, we need to look out. So yeah, that could happen, right? There's no guarantees, I don't think, in that sense. So I don't think that's what Scripture on the whole calls us to. Whether we can hope, and this is where in my books I actually, which for a philosopher is really quite out there, say that I think we can have reasonable hope in some sort of life after death. It's rooted in the fact that this love is so powerful that we can hope that somehow, and not for ourselves, right? I've had actually I don't think I have a claim to more, but to the people who've had lives that are brute and horrible and over, right? That on behalf of those people, and given the power of this love, which is only more powerfully expressed, we can hope that somehow agape is the final word for them. But that is a hope. That is not something that we expect to come in and do something or substitutes for our direct activity in the present. So, and I don't think it's helpful. We changed around 2005. So when I published the articles back in 1999 in the Chronicle and the Morning News, it was 36 inches of sea level rise, right, and a 2-degree temperature change. That was the worst case scenario. And back then, we'd amp that up to try and get people's attention. And around 2008, 2007, the worst case scenario became so terrifying that suddenly everyone stopped talking about it because we figured I don't remember anyone talking about it, they just stopped because it had such significant planetary potential. So so on the one hand, we have to be realistic. Things can happen. We're not under some special dispensation. On the other, I don't think it's helpful to work out of fear. I want to work out of love. Take joy in what we have today. Enjoy all the species we have now. And that. So anyway, nice question. Thank you. Very complex.
So I was struck by your language about how we even think about climate change in terms of self-interest, which I had not really thought about. Our argument is, well, unless you do something, your children are going to, or your grandchildren, and that actually is what I hear you saying in some ways, a wrong way of thinking about it. That really what we should be seized by is not something for our own self-interest, but for the interest of all creation. Mm-hmm. Is that what you're asserting?
And all creatures.
In all creatures. All creatures.
Yeah, all creatures. So I want to, creation's a bit too abstract. I like creatures, and I care for creation for the sake of creatures.
So how would you understand?
All creatures. I want that love to be the motivation.
So how would you understand what we celebrated last week in Holy Week, not in anthropomorphic terms? How would you understand the cross and resurrection, not simply, we've turned that into an self-interest, haven't we? Well, my soul's going to be saved, right?
Right.
That's why I follow Christ. My soul will get to heaven. is some of the language. So how do we even shift? It seems to me a lot of our liturgy, a lot of our very practices of the Christian faith in some ways are geared around self-interest. And how do we shift and anthropomorphize it?
And it's natural, right? And maybe there's a place for it to some degree. This is how Pascal's wager works. People put Pascal, but what Pascal says is an order of the body, where people are just interested in the body, and people who are just interested in the body, they know nothing of the mind, and they know nothing of love. They can't be motivated that way. And he says there's people who are of the mind, the level of the mind, brilliant with the mind, all that sort of stuff, but they don't understand love. It's a whole other order. And his wager argument is for people at the level of the mind to try to get them to start acting lovingly. In other words, go and do likewise, in the hope that as they go and do likewise, they'll start to love and be leveled up to this next level. In other words, so his wager is only a wager at this level. It meant to move on. So what I'm saying is it's natural for us to act in our self-interest. There might even be a place for it, right? So, of course, I don't like the metaphor, but it's milk versus meat, maybe, that Paul talks about. And so, so maybe with some people in some approaches, you need theology that's not great, that's self-interested, that's maybe more rigid, because that's where that person is. And so there might be a use for that theology, but only if you're self-aware of the fact over time, the need to move, and you're aware of the limitations. In terms of the cross and resurrection, I have a YouTube channel, and I have a sermon I posted that I put on called The Passion of Lent. And so one of the dangers of Lent, of course, is when we see the Passion, we ask, what is the Passion of Passion Week? What is the Passion of Jesus? And you say, well, it's the suffering on the cross, which ends up then glorifying suffering. And really just suffering for its own sake, or worse, suffering to make God happy, as if suffering would make God happy. I have a thing, by the way, in here on sacrifice, right? And so, let me not get up onto that. And so what I say, what I argue is not only is that problematic, but it doesn't reflect the ministry and teachings and passion of Jesus. Why was Jesus crucified? It wasn't so that Jesus could save us from our sins. No one crucified Jesus for that reason. It was because Jesus was such a concrete threat to exploitative social and political and economic dynamics. All right? So Jesus, in a context of empire, and the cross, by the way, the cross, in 4 BCE, the Romans crucified 2,000 Jews in mass, right, in order to quell an incipient insurrection. So you all know by 72, the Jewish rebellion is going to be so significant, Rome's going to come through and obliterate the whole state, right? So during Jesus' time, the Zealots are about a rebellion movement in the countryside over the rule, oppression of Rome, right, who are occupying Israel as a colony. That's why tax collectors are so hated. They're collaborators, right? They're funneling money to the Romans, and they get their cut from the excess they can get. But it's mainly that Roman collaboration that's such a big deal, right? So what is the passion of Jesus? Well, it's precisely the passion we've been talking about. It's the passion for all of these oppressed faces around him who have him, right? And who have him so strongly that even as he sees the consequences coming, right? Even as he sees the threat of empire towards him, he stays true. So the passion of Jesus, the passion of Passion Week, is precisely the agape we're talking about. And it's Jesus' fidelity to that passion, even unto death on a cross, which God delights in. Not the suffering, but the fidelity even in the face of the suffering. Now, you're right, that's not how a lot of our liturgy works. I think we need to work on it and reform it. And I think we can, because I think, again, that's why I go back to the Spirit thing. I think even people who would answer it wrong, they actually would resonate and understand the passion I'm talking about. You know what I mean? It's just that it's so I grew up in a really fundamentalist, it's a great church, by the way, but more fun, and it's different now than when I was there, but very fundamentalist in understanding. The theology I found problematic. Their spirit was wonderful, right? What they did. They were, in a sense, betrayed by their theology. So I want to make those distinctions. I don't want to equate the theology with the actual spirit, but theology matters. right? So Calvin says, in one place, in response to someone saying, what should I do if my master or my husband whips me? And he says, think of your sins and see this as punishment from the Lord. Well, I don't think so, right? That's bad theology. There's a lot of great Calvin, but that's bad. Bad theology matters. The idea that suffering is redemptive in its own sake, that matters. And that's a message that's been used to harm people. So we need to work on it. And also then how suddenly the Passion of Passion Week is something everyone should respect, whether they're Christian or not, right? So this gives us a very powerful place to be also, right? So we're not, this is suddenly the cross is this amazing period. And so for us to be Christian, for us, what it is for me to have faith in Jesus, it's not to believe a bunch of things about Jesus, it's to have the faith of Jesus. It's right. It's to have that same passion, to surrender to that same passion to that same degree. So to have faith in Jesus in this sense is to share in the faith of Jesus and the passion of Jesus and the passion of Passion Week. Right. The New York Times on Good Friday put out an opinion piece saying, "Let's get rid of God." Right. It's just So how does something like that happen in the New York Times against any serious understanding of the passion of Passion Week? This is where our bad theology can get us, and the bad representation of our theology. So, but I want to be really careful about going after people's theology.
So thank you, Dr. Y'all are invited to the fellowship hall. There are some appetizers and things to snack on, a chance to fellowship, and encourage you to do so. Thank you.